The first scream came from row 12B, sharp, piercing, and enough to make every head turn. The sound cut through the quiet hum of the engines, the shuffle of snack wrappers, the lazy whispers of people halfway across the Atlantic. For a second, nobody moved. Then came the words that would change everything. The pilot's collapse. Olivia Harper froze mid-sip of her orange juice. She wasn't supposed to be anyone special that day, just another passenger on Flight 239 from New York to London, sitting in 8A, a window seat she'd booked mostly to avoid small talk. The seatbelt light blinked off. The clouds below looked like soft ice cream. Everything was calm, ordinary, until it wasn't. A flight attendant sprinted down the aisle, her face pale. Olivia leaned out just far enough to see through the open cockpit door. A man in a pilot's uniform was slumped over the controls. The co-pilot was shouting into his headset, hands moving frantically over switches. Something was wrong, very wrong. A collective silence swallowed the plane. Passengers stared at one another, waiting for anyone to say it was fine. The attendant's voice shook over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We're experiencing a situation in the cockpit. Please stay seated." Olivia felt her pulse pounding in her ears. A situation? That was airline talk for panic, wrapped in politeness. She turned to the older woman beside her, who clutched her rosary so tight her knuckles whitened. "It's going to be okay," Olivia whispered. Though her own voice trembled, she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Then came the jolt. The plane dipped, not sharply, but enough to make drinks slide off trays and babies start crying. The co-pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, tight and urgent. "If there is anyone on board with flight experience, please come to the cockpit immediately." Nobody moved. You could have heard a pin drop. Olivia's heart hammered. Her hands were clammy. She wasn't a pilot, not technically, but she had flown small planes before. Her late father had been a flight instructor in Arizona, and she'd spent most of her teenage summers learning from him. She'd logged nearly 200 hours in a Cessna before life, college, and fear grounded her dreams. That was years ago. This was different. A Boeing 7037 wasn't a Cessna, and hundreds of lives were at stake. She looked around. No one else was standing. No one else was even breathing right. Olivia felt something rise in her chest. Not courage, exactly, but the sharp understanding that doing nothing was worse than failing. She unclipped her seatbelt and stood. The aisle felt like a tunnel of eyes as she walked toward the cockpit. A flight attendant grabbed her arm. "Ma'am, please sit down." "I can help," Olivia said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I've flown before. Small aircraft. I know the basics." The attendant hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Follow me." Inside the cockpit, chaos hummed. The co-pilot's forehead glistened with sweat. The captain lay slumped against his harness, motionless, his face ashen, oxygen mask dangling, heart monitor beeping. "He's gone into cardiac arrest," the co-pilot said without looking up. "Medical team's on standby at Heathrow, but I can't do this alone." Olivia's breath caught. The view ahead was endless sky, and below, somewhere far beyond those clouds, the Atlantic Ocean. She could see the flight path flickering on the digital map. They were halfway across. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. The co-pilot looked at her, studying her face for a moment too long. "You said you've flown before?" "Yes. Small planes. Cessnas." He hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. I need you to monitor the altimeter, keep an eye on our speed, and help me communicate with ATC. We'll have to divert. You follow my lead, all right?" She swallowed hard. "All right." Her fingers hovered over the unfamiliar panels. So many buttons, dials, glowing screens. It was nothing like the old analog cockpit she remembered from her father's plane. But she forced her mind to focus. Numbers, patterns, readings. It was still flying. Still sky and speed and gravity. Different tools. Same fight. Minutes crawled. The co-pilot, Mark, his name badge said, worked with controlled panic, trying to stabilize altitude. Olivia followed instructions, reading off numbers, checking flaps, repeating radio calls. The headset crackled with British accents from ground control. Flight 239, confirm you have an incapacitated pilot on board, Mark replied, his voice tight. Affirmative. One pilot down, one assisting passenger. Copy that, the radio answered. We're rerouting you to Shannon Airport, Ireland. Prepare for emergency descent in 30 minutes. Shannon. That meant they'd need to cross more open water before even seeing land. Olivia's stomach twisted. She glanced at the unconscious captain, his chest barely rising. Another attendant came in to perform CPR, her hands pressing rhythmically as the plane shook lightly in turbulence. The passengers had no idea what was happening up front. Olivia could hear muffled crying through the door. People praying, whispering, sending messages to loved ones. The thought hit her like a punch. They all trusted her now, whether they knew it or not, and she wasn't sure she deserved that trust. Mark's voice broke through her thoughts. We're losing pressure in engine 2. What does that mean? It means, he said through clenched teeth, we could stall if it gets worse. The cabin lights flickered. A low mechanical growl rolled beneath their feet. Olivia's grip tightened on the control yoke. The co-pilot adjusted throttle settings, muttering under his breath. Come on, come on. Then, silence. One of the engines coughed out completely. The plane dipped again, harder this time. A collective scream rippled through the cabin. Alarms shrieked in the cockpit. Red lights flashed. Olivia's body went cold. Engine 2 out, Mark said. We're on single-engine ops now. Her training, rusty as it was, kicked in. Can we glide? For a while, but not forever. For a moment, everything narrowed. The sound, the air, even time itself. Olivia remembered her father's voice from years ago, calm and steady. The plane doesn't fall out of the sky. You just have to keep flying it. She inhaled, steadying her trembling hands. Tell me what to do. Together they fought the descent, reading out numbers, adjusting pitch. The plane responded sluggishly, like a stubborn beast refusing to climb. Outside, the sky had turned darker, clouds thick as smoke swallowing the sunlight. Lightning flashed in the distance. A storm was brewing ahead. Of course, Mark muttered bitterly. A damn storm. The turbulence hit like a wave. The entire cabin rattled. Overhead compartments burst open, luggage tumbling. Olivia gritted her teeth, keeping the nose level as best she could. We can't fly through that, she said. We don't have a choice, Mark replied. If we divert south, we'll run out of fuel. She glanced at the gauges. The fuel indicator flickered in warning orange. They were burning too fast. Her throat tightened. We're not going to make it to Shannon, are we? He didn't answer. The radio crackled again. Flight 209, we're tracking your descent. Do you have visual on land? Negative, Mark said, his voice strained. We're in heavy cloud cover. Olivia could feel sweat dripping down her back, her knuckles white against the controls. The storm swallowed them whole. Thunder roared, lightning split the sky. For a moment, the cockpit lit up bright as daylight, then fell back into dim red gloom. The plane shuddered violently. The yellow masks fell like ghostly fruit from the ceiling. Olivia yanked hers on, heart pounding. The cabin behind them filled with panicked voices. A child screamed. A man yelled prayers. Through it all, she held the yoke, forcing the plane steady, her muscles burning. Come on, she whispered to herself. Stay with me. But the altimeter was already dropping faster than it should. Olivia's eyes darted to the readings. 29,000 feet. 27,000. 25,000. The rate was too fast. And then through the crackling static of the radio, a calm voice cut in. Flight 239, this is air traffic control. We're reading a rapid descent. Who's flying that plane? Olivia's eyes flicked to Mark. He looked at her. You are? He said quietly. And before she could respond, another sharp bang echoed, followed by the sudden, horrifying silence of an engine that had just died. The plane began to fall. The plane began to fall. Not a gentle drop, but a gut-wrenching plunge that sent every stomach on board flipping inside out, the cabin filled with screams. Oxygen masks swung wildly, and the overhead lights flickered in manic rhythm. Olivia's hands locked around the yoke, her entire body tense. Her ears popped, her vision blurred, and through the chaos, she heard Mark shouting, "Pull up." "I'm trying," she yelled back. The controls felt like stone in her hands. The airspeed indicator screamed upward. The altimeter spun like a clock on fast forward. The roar of the wind outside grew louder, closer, monstrous. "Restart sequence," Mark barked, slamming switches, his hands moving with desperate precision. The cockpit glowed with flashing red. Engine failure, pressure loss, terrain alert. Olivia's pulse thudded like thunder in her ears. She thought of the hundreds of lives behind her, families, kids, the woman with the rosary, the man who'd smiled at her earlier and said he hated flying. Every scream seemed to claw at her spine. "Come on," Mark muttered through gritted teeth, flipping another switch. "Come on." The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught with a deafening roar. The plane jolted. Olivia felt it respond under her hands. Not steady, but alive again. "Engine 1 back online," Mark shouted. Olivia pulled the yoke with every ounce of strength. The plane resisted, then slowly, painfully, began to climb. Coffee cups rolled down the aisle, a laptop crashed to the floor, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't falling anymore. "Leveling at 20,000, she said breathlessly, her eyes glued to the gauges. "Good. Hold it there. Easy." Her arms trembled from the effort. She glanced at the radar. The storm was still all around them, a mass of angry red. They'd survived one disaster, but they were far from safe. "How much fuel do we have?" she asked. Mark checked the gauge, and the color drained from his face. "Not enough to reach Shannon." Her mouth went dry. "Then where?" He stared ahead, thinking, "There's an airstrip, small one on the west coast of Ireland. Civilian. We can try to land there." She nodded, even though fear gnawed at her insides. Try wasn't a word she liked hearing at 30. The radio crackled again. "Flight 239, we've lost your signal intermittently. Confirm your situation." Mark responded. "Single engine, one pilot incapacitated, passenger assisting. Request emergency landing clearance at the nearest airfield." "Copy, Flight 239. Divert to Kilrush airstrip. Coordinates incoming." Olivia repeated the numbers, trying to keep her voice steady. Her mind worked through the old lessons her father had taught her. Speed, altitude, angle of descent. Everything had to line up perfectly. A jetliner wasn't meant for tiny airstrips. One mistake, and they'd skid, flip, or worse. She glanced back at the captain. Still unconscious. The medic attendant shook her head silently. Olivia looked away. There wasn't time to grieve. Minutes passed like hours. The storm thinned at last. Clouds tearing open to reveal patches of ocean below, dark and endless. Mark exhaled shakily. "We're clear of the worst of it." Olivia risked a glance out the window. Through the mist, She could see faint glimpses of green far below. Ireland. Land. A sob caught in her throat. We made it to land. Not yet, Mark said grimly. Now comes the hard part. The descent began. Olivia followed his instructions carefully. Flaps down, speed reduced. The controls trembled in her grip. She could see the coastline now, jagged and wild, waves crashing against cliffs. And there, nestled in a stretch of farmland, was the faint outline of a runway. Short, narrow, glistening with rain. The radio buzzed again. Flight 239, you are cleared for emergency landing. Runway lights are active. Emergency crew standing by. Olivia's heart pounded. Her palms were slick with sweat. Okay, she whispered. Let's do this. Keep her steady, Mark said. Descent at 1,000 feet per minute. Don't overcorrect. She focused on the instruments, guiding the plane lower. The wind buffeted them side to side. Passengers screamed again as turbulence hit. Olivia gritted her teeth and adjusted. Her entire body was trembling, but her mind locked on to one goal. Get them down alive. The runway loomed closer, a dark line against the green fields. Speed 150, Mark called. Flaps full, she echoed. The plane bucked in the wind. Too fast, too high. We're coming in steep, Mark said. Ease her down. She pulled back gently, correcting angle. The ground rushed toward them. Rain streaked the windshield. Olivia's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Every instinct screamed to close her eyes, but she didn't. She couldn't. Gear down, Mark ordered. Gear down, she said, lowering the landing gear. The heavy thunk vibrated through the floor. Steady, steady. The runway filled the view ahead. Olivia's grip tightened. She adjusted, leveled, and prayed. The wheels hit the tarmac with a bone-jarring slam. Tires screeched. The plane bounced, then hit again, harder. Every seatbelt snapped tight. Drinks flew. Luggage crashed. Brake! Mark shouted. She pressed the pedals. The engines roared in reverse thrust, the noise deafening. The runway lights rushed past in a blur. Olivia's vision tunneled. Her body shook from the force. We're running out of strip, she cried. Hold it! Hold it! The plane slowed, slower, slower, until at last, mercifully, it stopped. Dead still, silent. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, like a wave breaking, applause and sobs filled the cabin. People cried, hugged, shouted her name. The woman who flew the plane. Someone yelled. Olivia sat frozen, unable to process any of it. Her hands still gripped the controls. White-knuckled, Mark leaned back in his seat, exhaling in disbelief. You did it, he whispered. You actually did it. Olivia laughed, half shock, half tears. I can't feel my hands, she said. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. The door opened, and fresh air, cold, wet, glorious, flooded in. Passengers began to file out, trembling but alive. Olivia stood finally, her knees weak. As she stepped into the aisle, people reached out to touch her arm, thank her, whisper blessings. She barely heard them. It all felt unreal, like a dream she hadn't woken from. At the foot of the stairs, she looked back at the plane. Smoke curled faintly from one engine. The sky above was clearing, streaks of gold breaking through gray. She breathed deeply, feeling the ground solid beneath her feet. Hours later, inside a small airport terminal, Olivia sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping lukewarm coffee. Her hands still shook. Reporters crowded outside, flashbulbs flickering through the glass. The co-pilot sat beside her, quiet. You saved them, Mark said softly. She shook her head. We saved them. He smiled. You know, Not many people could have done what you did. Not after 10 years away from a cockpit. She looked out the window, watching the rain fall on the tarmac. My dad used to say flying isn't about control. It's about trust. Trust in the plane, the sky, yourself. Mark nodded. He was right. A paramedic approached then, saying the captain had survived, stabilized after the medics took over. Relief flooded through her so fast it made her dizzy. She pressed a hand to her chest, tears welling. Thank God. Thank you, the paramedic added quietly. Without you, none of them would have made it. That night, when the news broke, Olivia's face was on every channel. Passenger lands plane after pilot collapses. The headlines read. She watched numbly from her hotel room, unable to connect that brave stranger on the screen with herself. The woman on TV looked calm, collected. Inside, Olivia still felt like she was falling, but somewhere between fear and faith, she had remembered who she was. The girl who once dreamed of flying. The daughter who'd learned from a man who believed she could. Maybe the sky hadn't forgotten her after all. When she finally closed her eyes, the hum of engines still echoed in her ears. But this time it was peaceful. Safe. She'd flown through a storm, and somehow she'd found her way back to the ground. And maybe that's what courage really is. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep flying through it.